Stephen, of course, is famous for a whole row of things beginning with P: pianos, poetry, painting, perfume, and puddings. Most of which I would subscribe to, I think, pretty firmly. I think it's very good. The Economist described him as one of 20 living polymaths. And, of course, his prize-winning career and his CBE are well known to people, as are his well over 60 recordings, the latest of which is a complete chronological sequence of the Chopin nocturnes, which is absolutely gorgeous. Stephen, can we start by asking you to talk about what it's been like for you coming back into performance after the lockdown and how that's affected you in terms of your experience?
Well, it's exhausting, Vincent, actually, because, for a year or more, 18 months, the pace changed significantly. And then it's been full on, really, for the last 2 months, and it continues into next year. And many orchestras which cancelled concerts in 2020 and 2021 are now rescheduling, plus the new concerts are coming in. So 2023 now, I'm looking at I said to my manager, I just don't actually know how we can manage to do this, because, if it's Beijing one day and Amsterdam the next, how do you... So it's a little bit of that. But I think we're all adjusting now to the new situation like we adjusted last year. And I think we're all going to have a couple of years of a little bit, sort of a bit of chaos, actually.
And how did you adjust to the fact that you were, because you must be, certainly during the concert year, which is pretty much like the academic year, isn't it?
Yeah.
It runs from about September through to June or something like that. You're on the road nearly all the time, aren't you, during those months most of the time?
I was for 30-odd years, and the summers too, because that's happened. That wasn't the case 100 years ago when Rachmaninoff was playing. The season did end like your academic year, but now the summer festivals begin in June, and some of the biggest, most important ones are in July and August, and then you're through. So you can actually play every single week of the year, and you have to make sure that you have the discipline to say no and find that space for relaxation or to do other things.
Academics are notoriously bad at saying no, and they suddenly look at their diary and realise they've got something committed endlessly in front of them. Have you got the will to be able to say no these days?
Well, again, over the last year, it was very hard to say no when everything was getting cancelled.
Yeah.
So I think we all said yes to everything because we knew that half of it wouldn't even happen. But then the problem is when it does happen. So as I say, I think this is just a period of adjustment. Nobody knows how they're going to get through the next couple of years. But, well, let's talk I'll tell you, I have a few more grey hairs by then.
You've been in the States recently, I think, and done some concerts over there. But more recently, you've just done 2 concerts up in Liverpool. And you're back in Manchester this weekend, I think, playing with the BBC Philharmonic. And I wanted to ask you to talk a bit about the Northwest, really, and about the fact that Manchester and Liverpool are really sort of 2 magnetic loads in your life, aren't they, in terms of your musical experience and your own upbringing?
Oh, totally. I lived in Cheshire until I was about 40 when I moved down to London. So that was there. And my mother was born in the centre of Liverpool. My first piano lessons were in Liverpool and the Wirral. And then I went to school in Manchester to Cheathams at the Royal Northern College of Music. I heard my first concert ever in the Philharmonic Hall as a little boy. And I said to my mother, do you think I'll ever be on that stage someday? And of course I was just a couple of days ago. And it came back to me because my entire family now is dead. I'm the only one left, really. So, but they all were from that part of the world. So yeah, I feel very much, although London is home now, it's not roots.
And when you go back to play in the Northwest, does it feel like a homecoming in some sense? Does it feel like that is there a different musical timbre to the life that you have up there than you have in other parts of the world or other parts of the country?
I don't think so, really, because I think one of the most wonderful things about this life of traveling around the world is that you make friends and make homes in everywhere. So I play in the Sydney Opera House, and for that week, that's home. Yeah. And there's something rather wonderful about that. Yes, sometimes you feel displaced, but there's a poignancy to that because it's almost like being a missionary. I mean, you're taking this music all over the place and you're bringing this the message of these composers to these different people, many of whom, of course, you will never meet. But I find that whole thing very powerful and poignant, actually. It's almost like being a doctor, you know, with music as the healing force, and you're dispensing this extraordinary thing and then leaving town, and you hope that some of it takes root and that some of it actually performs its task.
Yeah. Do you ever find yourself somewhere where you think, I'm not going back there again, or do you shake the dust from your feet and say...
Well, there have been places. I think it's more bad acoustics, bad pianos. Those are the places when you think, I really don't want to be here again. But then that can change. I was just in a hall in Toronto a few weeks ago, which had, the presenter told me that another colleague of mine had said that this was the worst piano in the whole of North America. So I asked in advance, could we find another instrument? And she actually did. She brought in a different piano, so that was nice. But that was a place I was thinking, I'm not sure I really want to go back there again.
Okay. You talked about your mum taking you to a concert in the Philharmonic Hall. This would have been in the mid to late 60s, I suppose, would it?
Very late 60s,
okay.
Yes. Maybe even early 70s.
Right, so that was still the Charles Groves years, was it?
Definitely.
In many ways, that was a remarkable period, wasn't it? I mean, he did the first complete Mahler cycle, I think, in this country.
That's interesting.
So he was quite an experimental conductor. I mean, that was the years that I was in the youth orchestra, and so I was on that stage myself sometimes, and enjoying it very much. But I mean, was your mother musical? Did you come from a musical background?
Not at all. We had no music in the house at all. No classical records. I think we had The Sound of Music when it came out, and we had Frank Sinatra and some Irish jigs and things of it. I mean, nothing, just a few, 5 LPs. But I had an aunt who lived close by, and we went to visit her, and she had a piano, and I was always fascinated by this piano, and I would play tunes. My father said that I'd memorized over 70 nursery rhymes by the time I was 2.
That's extraordinary.
Which I didn't even know there were 70 nursery rhymes, but still. And I would pick these out on my aunt's piano and ask, could I have piano lessons? And they always said, no, you'll get bored, and then we'll have a big piano in the house, and what are we going to do with it? But I was very persistent, so eventually they bought a piano from a local antique shop for £5. And my mother got out the yellow pages, and she opened at P and looked under piano teachers and found the one who lived closest, much as you might find a plumber, and so Miss Riley came to the house, and that's how it all started. And it was actually in Liverpool that it changed, because my father had TB, and he was in a sanatorium on the Wirral there, and we would go to visit him, and my treat was to go to the big piano shop, Cranes. You probably know Cranes in Liverpool. Cranes, yes. And I would go over and I'd play these big grand pianos. And I was playing one day, and a teacher from Liverpool called Stephen Waring heard me play, and he came over and he said to my mother, your son's very talented, but he's being taught badly. I'd like to teach him. So she had no idea. She really thought that this was a skill that I'd be able to use at parties. I'd be able to play songs for people to sing, and that would be the limit to the use of playing the piano. So she started thinking, and she had some friends whose daughters were studying at the Royal Manchester College of Music then. So I went to play for them, and they said, yes, he's talented. So I started lessons with Heather Slade. And I was about 6, I suppose, or 7 by then. So.
And how did the move to Cheathams come across?
Well, within a year of having lessons with Heather, I won a competition that had me playing actually at the Purcell Room. This was 1968. It was only freshly built at that point. And it was very fast at that point. And I think we'd heard about Cheathams, and so it was thought that it might be a good place for me to go. In those years, it wasn't such a good place, and I think it was very destructive for many people, including me in a way, although not in terms of the abuse that was very much in the news. I think Cheathams is actually one of the miracles in that it has turned this around in an astonishing way, and it's now a marvelous place, and I've been there very often over the years to see the students, and it's very healthy and happy and full of wonderful young players.
And then you went on to the Northern College.
That's right.
And from there to the Juilliard.
Yeah.
And you now teach at the Northern College and at the Academy, don't you? I think, are you?
Well, I teach at Juilliard actually now. I have
Juilliard
2 students there, but I'm visiting chair at those 2 English places. But I go 1 afternoon a year, so it hardly qualifies really. But I like to have the connection.
It's almost as hard as Oxford professors work.
I was actually at the RNCM just a couple of days ago, and I had an afternoon with the students there, and it was wonderful. I like to have that connection, but I just don't have time to commit
I can imagine.
to students. But Juilliard, I do have 2 students that I actually teach, and both of them I only knew from Zoom until last month, when I was finally able to go back to New York and see them in the flesh. And so it was really very emotional, because with one of them we'd done a lot of work on Zoom. And then finally I get to meet the real person, and he's a wonderfully talented student. So I enjoy that. I think maybe as I get older I'll want to do more teaching, just for I get so much out of it myself. I have my first student at Juilliard was a doctoral student there, and incredibly interested in everything, and you know, he'd have Mozart letters under his arm and first editions he'd come into lessons with, and he's now long graduated, but I write to him regularly to ask advice about, do you think Chopin means the phrase to go from this note to, and he comes back within 2 hours with all the source material and shot the manuscript, and he's really terrific. He's actually teaching himself now.
Yeah. And I think there's somebody, was it Douglas Steele, who was very influential in your life as a teacher?
Yeah, how do you know Douglas Steele?
I don't know of him. I've just heard you talk about him in other contexts.
Gosh, well, I've actually been writing some memoirs of all the things we're talking about now. And there's a chapter on Douglas Steele in there. He was apparently a brilliant man when he was young. He was an assistant to Beecham. He'd worked with Bruno Walter. But he had a terrible war, like so many people. And although he wasn't actually fighting, I think he was in intelligence, and he'd made some wrong decision, and people had been killed. And he had a nervous breakdown, basically, and never recovered. So he ended up teaching in Manchester, and he was quite crazy by the time I studied with him, but in a wonderful, well, it was that borderline between madness and eccentricity, and he was a wonderful person to be with, and I have a lot of affection for him. He was a brilliant musician, a beautiful pianist, and I talk about this in the book. I went over after I'd left Cheathams to his house, and we'd have curries in the Curry Mile in Rusholme, and we'd go back, and he'd play me things on the piano. I remember he took out these preludes of William Baines, who'd himself actually been invalided in the First World War. And he said, you must get to know William, wonderful music. And he played these preludes of William Baines. So we were talking, we had a drink and so on. And then he said, I must show you, I've been writing quite a lot of music. He takes out this manuscript paper and he starts playing these pieces that are the William Baines. But he'd written them out. He said, do you like them? And I didn't like to say, well, but they're not yours, are they? Aren't they? So I said, oh, yes, they're wonderful. They're absolutely. So he was crazy. And I remember going upstairs to use his loo. He'd pinned on the staircase, don't trip, take care with your step. And as you were walking up the stairs, it was all you could do not to trip over these bits of paper hanging off. And in the window, there was a big notice, burglars, go away. But he was a wonderful man, and I, in a sense, owe a lot to him. He's one of those teachers that you realize resonate with you years after. They can say a few important things which you keep with you.
I think that's one of the things about teaching, is that people come up to you 25 years afterwards and they say, do you remember saying to me, and it was probably a Thursday in February when you'd already done 6 hours teaching, and of course you didn't remember saying that, but it's made such an impact on them.
Yeah.
Isn't it true that he introduced you to the Gerontius chords?
Yeah, totally. Just one day he played those chords just at the point, 2/3 of the way through the first part, when Gerontius has died and the priest comes in. And it's really a circle of, not a circle of fifths, but it's a circle of chords. And he just played them to me, and he said, what's this? And I had no idea. He said, told me what it was, and he said, go and buy the records, get the score, study this. Everything was said in this kind of very brusque way, but with affection. So I did. I went to Forsyth's, and I bought the Barbarolli recording with the Halle Orchestra, Janet Baker, Richard Lewis. And I studied it. And in fact, it turned me around in many ways, because it introduced me to Catholicism, which I knew nothing about, and also to classical music, because I'd really lost interest. Those early years with Heather Slade, and I was practicing all the time. My early teens, I really, everything went wrong in a way, and I stopped doing work at school. I stopped being interested in music. I just watched television for 6 hours a day. And that piece pulled me around in a way, and it got me interested in music again.
Because your background is not Catholic, is it at all? No. I mean, I think a bit like my family. There's a bit of orange there somewhere.
Yeah, there's quite a. In fact, one of my relatives was a Grand Master of the Orange Lodge in Liverpool. So yeah, they were not happy about my interest in Catholicism.
No, yes, I mean,
those years, things have changed, of course, so much. Amazing. I was in Liverpool just as we were saying a few days ago, and I was with the conductor, and I was actually explaining a little bit of this, and he was astonished, about the stone throwing that went on. And my grandmother wouldn't let anyone in the house wearing green. She was so anti-Catholic and therefore anti-Irish, and it was such a strange world.
It was equal opportunity stone throwing, though. I mean, the Catholics would throw stones at the Orangemen when they were going to Southport for the glorious whatever, the 12th. And the Orangemen would throw stones at the Catholics on the Feast of St. Peter and Paul when there were processions around the city at that point. I remember that quite well. Yeah. But it was surprisingly, still very, very strong. And of course it went through the football clubs as well and all these various other things. It was quite powerful. So you began to feel the pull of Catholicism from the music, or was it you were curious in other ways?
I think the music was was an opening of a door, and then, of course, the text was by Cardinal Newman, and then I read that Newman had been an Anglican and had converted to Roman Catholicism, and I found that intriguing. I thought you were just born Catholic, and it was not possible to change. So I started doing some reading, and then I think there was something of the youthful rebellion about it. Because it was the one thing, I think, that my parents found horrific. I think they could have coped with drugs or all sorts of... But I think the idea that I might go to a Catholic Mass was just beyond the pale. In fact, my grandmother said, if you become a Catholic, I'll never speak to you again. And in fact, later on, when I went to Fatima, I brought her a rosary back, which I thought was a very provocative thing. It's a bit like lighting a joint in the kitchen or something. And she looked at it, and in the end, she actually sort of hung it up, and she was very gracious, much more gracious than I would have been. I was a bit of a bigot in those years, actually. I think when you convert, sometimes you just jump in at the deep end, and I did, and I wanted to become a priest, and I wanted to give all my music up and everything else. But certainly now things have changed, and they wouldn't take me.
No, well, I don't know. I wanted to talk a bit about that because in your novel, The Final Retreat, the troubled priest who's writing these little fervorini to himself over the course of a week in the retreat house, he says at one point that he sees the point of the priesthood as being a way of transmitting grace. And it seemed to me that was almost what you were saying a little while ago when you talked about your role of being the doctor arriving at a town to perform, and that there's a way in which perhaps performing for you is a way of transmitting grace. It's a way of inducting people into the music, of showing them the numinous. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's an incredible, privilege sounds a little bit twee, but I think it's a good word for it, really. I think that it's one of the few things you can do that go beyond religion, beyond politics, beyond anything, really, and yet somehow draw people together. You don't have to be able to speak the same language. You can have all kinds of different opinions, but for that moment on stage, you're united. I mean, you're sharing the spirit of Beethoven or Chopin or whoever it is. And there's something actually miraculous to me about that, especially at a time when there is so much polarization. And that's why people have spoken about the musician making political statements and would you play for this audience or would you... And I mean, there are certain circumstances which I probably wouldn't play, but I really would like to keep those out as much as I can. I mean, I think that it's one of the few times when we can meet in the middle, and not just in the middle, but above everything else, and share this incredible ecstatic kind of world.
And I think that struck me time and again, reading your various publications, that you're interested in that notion of ecstasis, of going out, of taking people away from the mundane and the everyday towards the boundaries of their known and lived experience to other things. I mean, that's quite almost, you might say, a priestly liturgical thing to do, isn't it? That in fact you're presiding at what becomes almost a kind of sacramental act of induction and transport for people.
Well, I think so. I mean, in fact, a number of priests that I spoke to at the time when I was thinking of giving up my music and going into the priesthood, they said, well, there are many saints who are priests, very few who are pianists. And more to the point, that the piano is your altar was the way one
yes.
put it. And I've not really ever quite managed to make that work for me because I'm too nervous and too self-absorbed, unfortunately. I mean, I try, but when you're in the wings, you're thinking, well, am I going to forget? Or, But the ideal is there for me, is literally, it's the introibo ad altare Dei. It's the sense that you walk towards the piano in a concert hall, and you are a dispenser of grace, and it's not your own grace, it's the grace of the composers.
You're a vehicle, aren't you?
And it's very similar to the priesthood. And of course, it's great because you're not coming with a message as such.
No.
Everyone can take their own message from what you're bringing, which, as I say, is a unique thing and a wonderful thing.
It strikes me the last three of your CDs, the late Brahms, the final Brahms pieces, the Vida Breve, and the new Chopin, the pieces there all seem to me to be, in a way, gesturing towards the unspeakable or the ineffable, the beyond themselves. I mean, there are bits on that Brahms. I've left strict instructions when I go that I want you playing the A major intermezzo from Opus 118 because that just seems to me to dissolve into the Empyrean. It just goes, doesn't it? It's such a lovely piece, and you've captured that sense of transition, if you like, or transference very powerfully in those recordings, even if you don't always feel it. You've done it yourself.
Well, I think Brahms is one of the great examples of the head and the heart united. There are many composers who write emotionally meaningful music and many composers with great brains and intellectual power, but somehow Brahms, to me, isn't unique, but he's one of the greatest at joining those together. Yeah. And I think those pieces are ideal examples of that because they are so brilliantly constructed. There isn't a spare note in there that you could take away. Everything, the proportions are perfect, and yet they're also incredibly moving and touching. And beyond that, there's a spiritual element because it's not just emotionally touching. They take you even beyond the emotions. They distill everything into these tiny, I don't know what the longest one is, maybe 4 minutes of the whole of those final pieces.
I think it's about 5:13 or something.
Yes.
I think it's yes.
Yeah.
But I mean, when Eliot says words after speech reach into silence. You said in your program note for that CD, you said some explorations, some passing of time as the light fades and the final cigar is extinguished, and it's a lovely image. But it's also that sense of stillness. Now, in Old English, stillness means peace. King Alfred famously says that he wants to translate books, if we then have stillness, if we then have peace. And I think that sense of the stillness at the end of a piece like that, and indeed I think at the end of a lot of the Chopin pieces, is just overpowering, really. It's wonderful. I noticed when you played the Montpu recently, the Musica Caída, that you said no applause at the end.
It was an experiment, yeah. I don't know, were you there?
No, I watched the stream.
Right.
But I wasn't able to be there in person, but I did watch the stream, and I thought it was wonderful.
Well, I think it could work. I'm not sure that it's the only way, because actually a friend of mine who was there said, well, it's a lovely idea, but actually the audience need to release themselves from this experience too. And in a funny way, applause isn't really about showing appreciation for the person playing as much as it is for the audience to have their moment of letting go. So
but it's that silence at the end, after the end of the piece, before the applause,
well, that's
which is so important.
Yeah.
And sometimes, I always think people should be kind of trained to be a member of an audience. I once wrote a comedy sketch called the BBC Concert Audience, which was about audiences were meant to behave. But there's the sense in which there's always somebody who wants to rush in. There's always somebody who wants to shout bravo too quickly before the batons come down, before the last notes faded away.
Yeah.
And the magic gets lost, doesn't it?
But how long do you leave the silence? It's the Mahler 9, isn't it? When someone who's just found the piece and wants to show everyone that they know when it's over, and they're cheering and so on. Yeah, it can be awkward though, that end, Because you want it to be natural, that silence at the end, and yet how long do you leave it? And I think this is where actually the performer, through the body language, has the control, whether the conductor actually does not put down the baton and has a way, and it's ballet, it's choreography, how you stretch out those seconds at the end until it's the right moment to hand over to the audience's applause.
One of the things that I think is characteristic of your playing is that you give the music time to breathe and time to expand. Is that something you think you've done more as you've got more experienced or you've got older? I mean, do you think you...
I'm not sure. I mean, I think that song and dance are, talking about Montpu with his canzoni dancers, are two very important elements. And I'm thinking even back to the Brahms, because that one that you mentioned, Opus 118, number 2, I feel that sometimes it's played too slowly. Because actually it is a sort of dance as well. I mean, because he's written long slurs over the 2 bars, but also these little lapping duplets. And I think to get both of those, it can't be too slow. And the same with the Chopin Nocturnes. I've been thinking about this a lot over the last year, how they are coloratura arias.
Yes.
And just as a singer, can't sing too slowly because the phrase has to end and you have to breathe. I think the same with those. And I think it all ties in with metronome marks with the Chopin. He gave metronome marks to half of them. And most of them are a little bit faster than are normally played.
But it's interesting because as a director, a theatre director, one of the first things you have to learn is that there's a difference between speed and pace. Mm. And a lot of inexperienced actors speak too quickly, but a really experienced actor can speak with pace. Yeah. And they're not the same thing at all, because it's all to do with rubato, it's all to do with giving room, it's all to do with letting the music or the words breathe along the way.
Yeah, and paragraphs too. Yeah. This is something I've been thinking of very much recently, because I think, I mean, even if we are experienced, we often swallow the ends of phrases, the ends of trills with students. Very often the end of a trill is smudged because you're thinking of what's next instead of finishing something before you begin something else. So paragraphs, stanzas, it's very much on my mind actually right now. And it was just playing the Brahms first, because this is a piece full of exactly these moments. You think of the second subject of the first movement, it has its time, its space, and it needs the time at the end of the phrase as much as time within the phrase.
I want to talk a bit about structure, because it seems to me that I mean, as a composer and as a writer, you must be constantly grappling with the issue of form and structure. I mean, you know, a sonnet has a form, so does a sonata, and both of them are important, and both of them have to be somehow articulated for an audience, and an audience has to somehow be able to identify that and pick up on the pulse of it and be aware of it. Is that something you're conscious of when you're composing your own stuff?
Yeah, actually, I've written 4 piano sonatas, and they're all in a kind of pyramid form, so they all end and begin the same, with the same material. Because I think this sense of return, which is what a sonata form is all about, you go on a journey and you come back somewhere. I think it is important. It's not the only way to write, and but the 2 forms that came about in the whole classical era would be the sonata form and the variation form. And they're kind of opposites, really, because the sonata form is a particular return, and the variation form is a constant form of developing. In a sense, you never leave home with the variation form, because you're always in the same room, it's just you decorate it. Yeah. Whereas with the sonata form, you can go a long way from home, but you come back at the end. And I think, I think one wants to feel, unless there's a very skillful use of another kind of form, one wants to feel this sense of recognition. And I think it's to do with repetition. I think life is about this, isn't it? Yes. I mean, the day that we live is about the sun rising and setting. I mean, that kind of repetition gives the form to our very lives. And I think we need a structure. And if we have a structure like that, then we can be wild. We can do all sorts of things between the sun rising and setting. But somehow, if it's never there, if there's no goalposts, if there are no doorposts, then we're less free, actually, ironically.
And there's a sense, isn't there, in which philosophy is the art of providing structure to life. It gives a pattern. It's there to, if you look at Plato and Aristotle and the great philosophers, what they're trying to do is to define the shape of existence to allow people to navigate their way through it. And it seems to me that structure in literature and in music is in some ways important in the same way, whether it's a 12-bar blues or a sonata or whatever it might be. It's partly that sense of coming home and knowing the place for the first time, as Eliot says.
And knowing the place, because I think because a composer knows the music that's being written, doesn't realize that the audience is hearing this for the first time. And actually, it's interesting that often a composer's thinking, well, I have to write something different. But actually, sometimes you have to repeat things because people need to hear them more than once in order to engage with them. And this is true, I think, in all kinds of situations.
And when you're composing yourself, the impression I get from your written work is that you write in relatively short bursts, presumably on planes or in hotel rooms or whenever you get the opportunity. I mean, the great collection of aphorisms and discussions in Rough Ideas, and then the episodes in the novel are all relatively short, aren't they? Is that a function of just simply the way that you write best? Or write? I
think so. It's just, and I've done that same with the next book that's I finished. It's traveling around. I never have even a week sitting. Well, I did during the lockdown, of course, but I don't have periods sitting at a desk day after day. So I found this, and I like short chaptered books anyway. I love reading them because I'm even reading like this in short bursts, and I think, in a way, it's also an extension of a poetic way of writing in a sense, because I'm interested in each chapter having its own presence and space and totality in a way, so that certainly in the novel it's a diary by the priest. That's the form, because that's how I wrote it as a diary. I could write in these short sections.
And he says at one point, if I can find it, he says rather interestingly, he says, I've always enjoyed the act of writing. I look forward to sitting at this desk every day, searching for words, yet being sought by words too, ideas as dialogue, an internal conversation of discovery. Is that the way you find it yourself, or is that just projection into his character?
Well, a lot of things in that novel, thank goodness, are projection into his
character.
Well, of course,
that's right, yeah.
He's a rather sad man.
Yeah.
I suppose so, yeah. I think I tend to create things very quickly and put them down and then think about them for a year.
Yeah.
So it's not a kind of slow, steady progress. And the same is true very much with writing music. Someone says, like they did, the Takash Quartet wanted a string quartet. So I just had all kinds of ideas and I threw them on the page all over the place. And I had a great big collection of sketches. And I carried them with me for 18 months. And then I start putting them into some sort of structure. And then I usually, at that point, copy them into a computer program because it's just easier to carry that around and to work from that. And then the refining process takes a long time.
Yeah.
And, it can be a bar out or in, which makes the difference between a section working or not.
I was interested, you talked about poetry because there's a comment in Rough Ideas where you say, poetry is a furnace that drives all art. And that really struck me. I mean, partly the idea of poetry as the furnace, but also the drive, the energy. Could you say a bit more about that? Because it seems to me that in a way, this notion of the poetic aspiration is something that links your writing about music, your writing of music, and also your writing about prayer. That it's about that sense of catching fire, of inspiration taking flight in some way.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think poetry is at the root of all art, really, because it's taking the prosaic and using that to go beyond words, to go beyond words. But I think the furnace idea I also think of in terms of the different things that I've done of writing words, music, or playing the piano. In a sense, the furnace is the poetry in the basement, and then these are all radiators in different rooms. They're coming from the same source. And I think why do we bother with art at all? I mean, I think all of it is about ecstasy. We're all trying to go beyond. I mean, that's what being a human being is. It's trying to live more than just the life, of existence. I mean, it's actually trying to celebrate that existence, that everything we do has a sacramental element to it, and we can transform that. And it's our intention that makes that happen. And in that sense, I think everyone can be a poet. And it's not just writing words on the page. It's actually, you live poetry.
Yeah.
And I think this is something in the lives of the saints that I find most attractive, is that actually kindness is poetry, compassion is poetry. All of it is going beyond what's just put that down on the table. It's like you put the ingredients for a meal there, and the poetry is actually cooking them, is flavoring them, is shaping them.
The medieval Arab literary theorists, people like Averroes and Avicenna, had this wonderful theory of poetry where they said it was an imaginative syllogism. And they said it didn't have to be good or bad, moral or immoral. All it needed to do was to create an act of imagination. And it was up to the audience then to decide how they responded to it, what they did with it.
Yeah.
That sounds quite similar to what you're talking about.
I don't know about that particular source, so that's fascinating. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it doesn't have to be, as I say, written down. In a sense, ballet is also poetry. It's poetry of the body. And so we can write down ballet, but I mean, it's a very limited form. We have to see it, we have to do it. And maybe we've lost something about this. I was actually thinking about Liverpool. I arrived there at Lime Street Station, and Liverpudlians are great poets. They love words, and they love puns, and within 30 seconds, I'd heard a couple of really interesting uses of the language, which I don't think you'd hear in many other English cities. So I think it's very, very true. And I think this is something that we should encourage in young people and across the board. Maybe people think you have to be sort of posh to be a poet or pretentious to be a poet, but I think everyone has this there within them, and this
in rough ideas, you say I think this is true of prayer, poetry, and music in your thinking. You say when vibrations in the air create vibrations in your soul. That's the essence of the communication of art, isn't it, in a way?
Well, certainly of music, yeah. We don't really know why certain pieces move us and others don't, I don't think. I'm not sure, well, we can sort of lay down certain harmonic truths and ways that we work with and against harmony. That's the whole fascination of tonality, really, and of atonality, how they clash with each other. But in the end, I'm not sure anyone can quite. It's a lot of different associations, how those vibrations work with us. But maybe we don't need to ask why. We just have to enjoy them.
They probably change, don't they, over somebody's life as well. I mean, I think, I'm conscious that there are Shakespeare plays now that I go to and I need a second hanky by the end of it because they've moved me so much when as a younger person they didn't speak to me at all. And I think that must be true of music and poetry as well. There are things you go back to that suddenly hit you with a force that was unexpected, and the vibration can come from a different direction. But to go back to the thing you were saying earlier on about grace, I mean, that is the point, isn't it? That's being the channel of grace, which is really just enlightenment. It's that idea of just letting something happen in the audience. Does it matter if the audience doesn't know about sonata form, or doesn't know about a sonnet, or doesn't know about the normal convention of a classical symphony?
I don't think it matters, but I just think that people will get more out of it if they know that. I mean, with a sonnet, I think knowing how brilliant the technique of a certain poet is helps us to appreciate it more. I mean, I think you can hear Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and be aware that you've had an experience that's incredibly satisfying. It's like looking at a building. There are certain buildings and the architecture, you can't say exactly why, but it's just satisfying.
Yeah.
It makes you feel good, or it gives you a sense of awe or a sense of coziness or whatever you're looking for. And I think it's the same with music. And there are certain pieces certain symphonies by maybe second-rank composers that have wonderful melodies or whatever, but they just don't quite sit right. You don't feel at the end that you've had a satisfying experience. And it's true, I think, in all of the art. Same with a painting. certain paintings just seem to be a unity that just pulls you. I mean, it's like a sort of a magnet. And other paintings can be very attractive, but they're diffuse somehow. You feel they're not quite held, organized.
I mean, that sounds to me like a very good definition of the numinous, the idea of the fact that there is something in all the arts that will transport you in some way, that will give you a kind of resonance beyond what you might be expecting in the everyday.
Yeah.
There must be times when you're performing where you think, actually, that was a more routine performance than I would normally do. But there must be other times when you perform something and it just comes together and you see new dimensions to it, or you see new focuses in it. Is that still the case that you're...
It's certainly true, but it's subjective, because I have heard recordings of performances I've given that I've thought had exactly that quality and actually were just very boring when I heard them back. And then sometimes you think you played badly and actually it sounds good when you hear it, or much better than you expected. So the person playing isn't always the best judge of that. But certainly with these great works, I mean, playing the Brahms, I've never enjoyed playing the Brahms first as much as I did this last weekend, and I've played it over 30 years. In fact, the first time I played it was in that hall, I think in the late 1980s. So it's a piece I know very well, and I'm thrilled by it more and more. And I think that's one of the most important things for a soloist to have. There are many things that you need to have a kind of lasting career, and I think one of them is this constant sense of wonder at the amazing beauty of this music that you're playing. And you can never get bored with it. And it's not just for performers, but for teachers. There'll be teachers who've taught a Chopin scherzo for 50 years, and I've come across them, and they're still thrilled by this music and transmitting what they want to get through to their students. And that's what it's all about, and the same in your world, lecturers who are talking about the same plays, the same poems year after year, and they're still, you can see they're on fire about it, and that's what it takes.
I lectured on Chaucer's Book of the Duchess for 44 years, and it always made me cry at the end.
Well,
I could never get to the end of it without crying at the end of it.
That's wonderful.
I mean, it's that's very important. We're going to come to questions in a moment, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about about prayer and poetry and how they link together. You say in your very interesting book, Bible as Prayer, which is a selection of Bible texts, prayer and poetry are siblings. They're words to go beyond words. And again, that seems to me that search for the transcendent, that desire to go beyond what's on the page, whether it's notes or words or whatever it might be. It's something. It's a kind of openness, isn't it? It's a sort of, what theologians might call kenosis, a sort of self-emptying, to let something else come in, which is maybe the work of art that you're performing or the words that you're writing or reading. Do you think?
Yeah, I suppose that's true. I mean, it's creating space, isn't it, for something to take place. And I think this is one of the dangers, perhaps today, is that there is so much crowding around us, that creating that space to hear a piece without distraction is difficult. It's one of the reasons why we must hold on to live concerts and not just have streams and recordings and so on, because I'm not sure you can ever really concentrate in the same way at home streaming. However much you want to, there's always the possibility of making that cup of coffee or of answering that email. Whereas in a concert hall, you're trapped. It's a huge embarrassment to stand up in the middle of the row and walk out. So I think that's a good thing, because I think that a concert, I don't want to be pompous about it, and certainly we want to encourage people to come, and but the idea that it's difficult to go to a concert. It's actually it's an arduous thing.
Absolutely.
It's like climbing a mountain. It's not like sitting in the bath.
Yes.
It takes energy and so on. And that's good, because the music is full of energy. And I think if those two can come together, we have a wonderful experience.
And it's also, I think, even as a performer, as a very mediocre double bass player, as a younger man, that I can vividly recall the moments where you were playing something, and being a double bass player was wonderful because everything sat on you, as it were. And when you could feel the hair coming up on the back of your neck as everything built, and as the texture evolved, and as the chords resolved. I just remember that feeling as being one of the most remarkable joys, really, of musical making, I think, for me.
Yeah.
Let's go to some questions now. We're going to alternate between people who are online and people who are in the room. So is there somebody here first?
Hello. Hey, great speech, great interview, by the way. I've been loving it. So I'm a pianist. I've played since I was 5, and I was wondering, like, how do you become successful how do you stick out as a professional musician, especially classical performer? There's now lots of famous people doing it, and especially as a younger person, like, what would that look like nowadays, do you think?
Gosh, well, that's a big question, and not with an easy answer. I mean, there are thousands of people who want to do that. It depends what that is, I think. Do you want to be a musician? Do you want to be famous and rich? Do you want to be on the stage? And I have met people, students, who I really sense, rather than interest in music, it's like being a film star or a rock star or whatever. And I think if you start with that, it's a bit dangerous. It's certainly not good for the musical side of it. But I think one has to have an honesty and a sense of, when you're studying, of concentration and of focus, because I think too often people enter music college already with the only interest being, which competition shall I enter? You know what? I think the important thing is to be absorbed in Beethoven, in Brahms, in whatever. But there are various, if you're leaving college or university, I mean, what do you do next? Well, I suppose competitions is the common route. It's certainly not an assured route. I mean, you can win leads and still not have a career. So I don't know really the answer to your question, but all I can say is good luck and go for it.
Yeah, Karen has asked online, are you still painting? I was very moved by your exhibition at the Broadbent Gallery several years ago now, and could see music in them.
Well, that's very nice. Painting is really just for fun. I mean, I certainly don't include it in professional life at all. But I did have that little exhibition. I put a few things on my website, and this art gallery owner was in touch asking who they were by, and so I said, well, they were by me, and then he said, well, could we put on a little exhibition? So that's how that came about. And I am still doing it, and I do sense something of the furnace in the cellar about it, because I love doing it. I mean, it gives me incredible, passionate, I would say almost an erotic charge to be working physically with the paints. I find just throwing some red paint on a canvas a very exciting thing to do. I love the vividness of the colors. And I've been working more recently with house paint, with gloss paints. I just love the way the light shines on it. So, and I would say that the connection with music is really texture, because I'm very interested in the piano, in how transparent I can make the piano sound. The piano is naturally a very opaque instrument. You shove the pedal down, you play 10-part chords, and it's all mud. So how do you make that into something where you hear every line? And not just in contrapuntal music like, say, Bach, but in all music, because it's not just melodically contrapuntal, it's harmonically contrapuntal. You're playing Rachmaninoff, you want to hear how these harmonies shift and how the inner voices change with one another, and how you use half pedals and quarter pedals and eighth pedals, and how you're going between those. And so that, I would say, is similar to painting, because I like to paint on many different layers. I like sometimes 8 different layers of paint, and sometimes the layer at the bottom you can't see anymore, but I know it's there, and it adds something to the texture of the final piece. So, yeah, well, thank you for the nice question about that.
Well, can I ask you about piano textures? Because I've noticed that your recordings are usually all made on a Yamaha in the South Bank Centre in recent years.
Well, recent years I've recorded almost exclusively on Yamahas.
Yeah.
Although, no, well, actually I say that, but I did in lockdown on a Bechstein, and then I did my Beethoven concertos on a Bösendorfer.
Yes.
So I'm quite promiscuous with my pianos.
Are there particular, I mean, when you find yourself arriving in a city to do a concert, I mean, some people take their own piano with her. Angela Hewitt famously totes her Fazioli with her wherever she goes, doesn't she, and got it broken. But, I mean, you must sometimes turn up and think, actually, this is like playing mud. It doesn't speak. Do you get a chance to change then sometimes?
Well, sometimes. I wouldn't want to take my own piano. I mean, I don't have a concert grand at home, so I don't have a piano to take around. I think you can become over-neurotic about pianos, actually. Of course, I want a wonderful instrument. For recording, I always go for the absolute ideal. But you arrive in a town, and it would be very impractical unless you were playing very few concerts. Actually, you can only play your own instrument, as Horowitz did, if you're playing 25 concerts a year, because physically, to get it from one place to the other is impossible. And also, piano needs to settle in. And it's not even just always about the piano, it's about acoustics. It's about humidity. It's all sorts of other issues. So, on the whole, best to take what's there and work with it.
Yeah. I mean, like organists, I always feel sorry for organists who turn up at some church to do a recital and you know, one of the pipes is siphoning or whatever, all sorts of weird things are happening, and they just have to work with what's there, really.
Yeah. I just remember the story of Liszt playing, I think in Dublin, and they presented him with an upright piano, and one of the dampers was sticking, so he had to have someone standing there to push it back every time he played it. And I thought, well, if Liszt can do this, you know, how can I ever complain about a piano?
That's fair enough.
But I will complain about it.
I have another. Yes, Christine.
I noticed that you use the metaphor of the furnace quite a bit, actually. You've used it twice when you talk about the furnace in the cellar. As a metaphor perhaps for poetry or for creativity in general. And it reminded me a little bit, I think it's Coleridge talking of Donne, where he describes what Donne does with words as wits forge and furnace blast, meanings press and screw. But the furnace is something that's both destructive and creative. So can you expand on that a bit? What does the furnace mean for you?
Gosh, well, I feel like I have to go away and write an essay about this now, because that's a really interesting distillation of that idea. And I hadn't really thought about it as destructive as well as creative. I just think it's that striking of a match, really, or the rubbing of two sticks together to create fire. I think it goes right back to the earliest human life and how fire is an incredible thing. You know, water is already there, air is already there, but fire somehow is something we have to make happen. And so I haven't thought about it. It's a sort of subconscious use of that word, but it just seems to me to be evocative of something flaring into life. Light, really, isn't it? It's bringing light to something.
And efflorescence as well. I mean, it goes back to that theme we've touched on quite a bit of what goes beyond where you go from the performance, because in a sense performance is destruction, isn't it? I mean, the music only lives in performance, but then it's gone, it's finished.
And so is life. You know, we're all older now than when we started this session, so you know, everything's being destroyed. Our skin is evaporating and
Yeah, we've got one from Yvonne who asks, what is Stephen's favourite music venue in which to play in the UK and then in the rest of the world?
Gosh, it's very hard to say, isn't it? Because if I don't say one, then that hall is going to be very upset. Well, you know, it's funny, I said about Liverpool that was the last place I played 2 days ago, and it was the first place that I played a professional concert. It was the first place I heard a concert. So that always has a very special vibe, the Philharmonic Hall in London. But there are many great halls in the world. You know, the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam is incredible. I was playing the Musikverein in Vienna a couple of months ago. And that's a hall, I think, maybe more than any other, when I'm conscious of the hall itself being part of the instrument. It's like the piano is screwed into the hall, and the hall becomes a great big piano, because the resonance is so rich and sympathetic. And so I find that thrilling, because you feel that, well, the hall becomes part of your voice for the evening, as indeed the piano is. So it's not really just, is this a nice piano or not? It's your larynx, you know, the piano for that evening. So it isn't just favorite halls, it's the combination of everything, really. Many great halls, of course, now in Asia, where classical music thrives in a way that sadly it doesn't quite thrive in Europe and America. Well, sadly for us, but not for them, and it's fantastic to work with students from that part of the world. I find this absolutely thrilling. The student I told you with the Mozart letters and everything else is from China, and you know, I think, I don't know how long in the future, but we're all going to be going there to learn about Western music rather than them coming here. So, but I'm very excited by that. I think it's marvelous.
Is there a particular shape that you think works well? I mean, the Musikverein's a shoebox, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think the shoebox seems to be.
Right.
It's containing sound.
Yes.
It's allowing sound to vibrate. You know, I mean, I think there are certain very basic things, aren't there, about flat surfaces not being good, wood being good. Sometimes you can look at a hall and think this can't possibly work, and it does. And then other times, you know, shoeboxes can be disappointing.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks for coming, Stephen. I've really enjoyed the talk so far. I have a pair of short related questions. First, in the piano repertoire, is there a work that you think is really unfairly neglected? Second of all, is there a work that you think others might acknowledge to be a really great piece, but somehow you just can't connect with?
Gosh, that's an interesting pair of questions. I think there are quite a lot of pieces that are neglected, really. Well, I'll throw out one that I think is a 20th century masterpiece that I recorded by George Santakis called Ghost Variations. It's a 30-minute piece. I think it's an absolutely extraordinary piece, and I think every young person should be playing it. So, I mean, some are. It's played quite a bit, but it's a big commitment. It's very hard to learn. It's 70 pages. It's long. If you're going to put it into a recital, you can't play much else in that half. But I think it's extraordinary and great. Overrated pieces. Gosh, I'm going to get into such trouble with this, but I think that Prokofiev 8th Sonata is overrated, I have to say. I love Prokofiev, and you know, I think Romeo and Juliet's my favorite ballet score. I think that the violin concertos are incredible. I'm not sure that the piano concertos are as great as the violin concertos, actually, but I do think the piano sonatas are slightly overrated, because I think that the Mettner piano sonatas are actually more interesting than the Prokofiev, and yet they're played much less frequently. So there's my, already people are either turning off or rude comments coming in. But it's interesting, because people do talk about 8th Prokofiev as being this profound, great piece, and I've always found it rather dull. But
have you found your repertoire shifting slightly? I mean, you recorded the Hummel very early on in your career, and I think, you know, it was one of the best-selling recordings of its time. But it seems to me that your recent work, you're moving into sort of high romantic and modern 20th century music. Is that fair to say?
Well, actually, it's something to do with the question you had about starting a career. You know, when I first started recording, you know, I was obviously unknown and just beginning. And in fact, Chandos, for whom I made the record of the Hummel, they said, you know, we'd like to make a record with you. We don't want Mozart, Mendelssohn, Chopin. Something unusual. What can you think of? And they said, what about John Field? And I looked at the John Field concertos and didn't really like them very much. And then a friend of mine in New York said, what about Hummel? And I knew the name, but I didn't know any music of Hummel. And he had the scores of those two concertos, and he said, well, take a look. And so we sat at his piano. This was Lowell Lieberman, the composer. And I thought, gosh, yeah, there's something wonderful about these. And then I started reading into them and realized that everyone played them. Clara Schumann and Chopin and Schumann, Robert Schumann, Brahms, they all played these pieces. So
they're in the DNA of later.
Yeah, well, you know, Hummel's great F-sharp minor piano sonata, which Liszt played all the time. I don't think it's an accident that Brahms and Schumann both wrote F-sharp minor piano sonatas. I mean, I think it was a subconscious, probably, memory, but it was there somehow in the fingers. So, yeah. So that's how it all began. And then when I started recording for Hyperion, at that point, Hyperion really only recorded either choral music or unusual repertoire. They did no Beethoven, Brahms, and so on. But gradually, as those records were well received, some of them, they offered me to do other things. And so now I'm recording pieces that I really wanted to play. Yeah, I think when I was younger, I was more interested in the pianist composers of the 19th century. I did Scharwenka and Sauer, and I did a CD of York Bowen, which I was really happy to do because his music was completely unknown and unrecorded. I think there's only one other CD with any York bone on it at that point. And now quite a lot of York bone's been done, and he's an unjustly neglected. He's not a great composer, but he's a very fine craftsman.
Do you curate the CD? I mean, Vida Breve starts with a Bach transcription and works its way through to your own stuff. That's presumably a very consciously curated sequence of music.
Yeah, I think if the CD, which of course is barely with us now because there's nowhere to play, we just got a new car, actually a second-hand car, and still it didn't have a CD player anymore. So, but I think the idea of a CD, if it's still going to work, is as some kind of a meaningful program, rather like a concert, so that there's a sense in which either you have the complete something which is all there, so you can have a reference point of the composer's whole output for piano, or you have a program that's like a meal with an appetizer and a dessert and a main course and wine.
The Adele of classical music. That's the thing. Have we got another one?
Yeah, we've got
question.
one last one. Are there any works that you're waiting for the right moment to record? Beethoven's sonatas, for example.
Not really. Because I've been lucky with Hyperion in that pretty much everything I've wanted to record, they've said okay, and we've gone ahead and done that. At some point, I've never played Bach professionally, and I've written a chapter actually in this book about how I don't love Bach. It doesn't mean I don't like him or I don't think he's the greatest composer ever, but the furnace has never quite warmed me enough yet. But I'm walking towards the fire. And I'm hoping at some point that I can record some Bach. So I still hold out. Probably not the Goldberg variations, but I'd like to do a Bach album of pieces that that mean something to me.
Thank you.
Stephen, we should take you away for a drink, but it's worth noting that it was Stephen's birthday yesterday, a birthday that he shares with the Feast of St. Cecilia and with Benjamin Britten. So I'm sure we want to thank you for joining us tonight and also give us the opportunity to celebrate your birthday with us later this evening. So thank you for being here. It's been wonderful.
Thank you, Vincent. My pleasure. Thanks. Thank you.